latest podcast, The Heidelcast.
It's a Heidel Minicast. And now, Scott Clark.
You might be surprised at what the Reformed churches confess about natural law and natural revelation in their confessions.
If the Heidelcast helps you, won't you help us keep it going? Please make the coffer clink by clicking on the PayPal link or by sending a check to Heidelberg Reformation Association, 1637 East Valley Parkway, number 391, Escondido, California, 92027.
It hasn't been popular on the theological left or the theological right for a while, but it's in the confessions.
The Heidelcast.
In the modern period, particularly in the 20th century, many Reformed people became uneasy with the traditional Reformed language concerning natural law. As one who began to enter the Reformed world about 1980, I mostly found Reformed people to be hostile to any notion of natural law. It was usually associated with expressions of autonomy or rationalism, though it was a bit of a struggle when, as a university student, I first read Calvin's Institutes, the 1559 edition, and I found him referring to natural law quite a lot. It was difficult to reconcile the way he and others from the classical period of Reformed theology spoke about natural law with the way that my contemporaries were speaking about it. As it turns out, my contemporaries were either ignoring the older Reformed doctrine of natural law, or they were confusing it with other versions of natural law that were not Reformed. For those who are deeply skeptical about the possibility of a Reformed doctrine of natural law, I ask you this. Consider the relative frequency with which the Reformed churches themselves, in their confessions, speak about natural law and natural revelation generally. Let's start with the Westminster Confession of Faith, which begins in 1:1 this way. Although the light of nature and the works of creation and providence do far manifest the goodness, wisdom, and power of God, as to leave men inexcusable, yet they are not sufficient to give that knowledge of God and of His will, which is necessary unto salvation. Again, that's Westminster Confession 1:1. Note that the divines did not say that the light of nature is not sufficient for civil government, but for salvation. For the divines, as for Calvin, civil government is one thing, salvation is another. I think theonomists, theocrats, Christian nationalists, and we'll just bundle them all together under the heading of theorecon, and I'm including the reconstructionists, right? Far too often the theorecons confuse these two things. Westminster Confession of Faith 1:6 says, and I quote, "There are some circumstances concerning the worship of God and the government of the church common to human actions and societies, which are to be ordered by the," wait for it, "light of nature," close quote. Notice that the divines taught that there are some circumstances, again, I listen to this language, common to human actions and societies that are ordered, again, quoting, by the light of nature. The divines use the expression the light of nature in similar contexts in Westminster Larger Catechism 2, 160, 121, and 151. The divines did not share the theonomic and Bardian skepticism about natural revelation and natural law. And I might add to that group also a number of Neo-Kuyperians. I didn't say Abraham Kuyper. I don't think Abraham Kuyper was a skeptic about natural revelation or even natural law. But a lot of Neo-Kuyperians have become skeptics. If I remember my history, the divines did not write during the Enlightenment. Pretty sure that's true because the Enlightenment didn't exist yet when they were writing, and yet they talked about natural law. For a lot of Neo-Kuyperians and others, the theorecons, the assumption is that anybody who talks about natural law or natural revelation is some sort of Enlightenment rationalist figure, and that's just not true. The Westminster divines were Christians, and they were Reformed.
Ladies and gentlemen, Scott Clark.
It's worth noting how often the divines speak about the, quote, nature of this or that thing, including the human nature of Christ, for example, in Westminster Confession of Faith, chapter 8. Yes, special revelation teaches us a great deal about the human nature of Christ, but not everything. Scripture assumes, as do the divines, that if our sense perception is working correctly, we perceive, with them, our senses, the truth about human nature. Scripture does not teach us what an arm or a leg or even skin is or how to eat. Scripture doesn't teach us a great many things about daily life or natural human experience. It does not intend to teach us those things. It intends to teach us about sin and salvation. How do we know what sort of humanity Jesus had? That he really is consubstantial with us. We know it because we know from experience what humanity is, and we know from Scripture that he was like us in every respect, sin excepted. If we become skeptical about nature as a genuine source of knowledge, we risk our Christology. The same argument applies to the doctrine of the sacraments. For example, Westminster Confession 29:5. The divines assume that we know what bread and wine are and what their nature is. Scripture does not teach us what is the substance and nature of bread and wine, only that they remain substantially bread and wine. We need Scripture to teach us what the sacraments are, but nature teaches us what bread and wine are. The Canons of Dort, third and fourth head of doctrine, Article 4, and it says, "There is, to be sure, a certain light of nature remaining in man after the fall, by virtue of which he retains some notions about God, natural things, and the difference between what is moral and immoral, and demonstrates a certain eagerness for virtue and for good outward behavior. But this light of nature is far from enabling man to come to a saving knowledge of God and conversion to him, so far, in fact, that man does not use it rightly, even in matters of nature and society. Instead, in various ways, he completely distorts this light, whatever its precise character, and suppresses it in unrighteousness. In so doing, he renders himself without excuse before God." Westminster Confession of Faith 10:4 says, "Be they never so diligent to frame their lives according to the light of nature." The confession assumes that it's possible for human beings to order their lives according to the light of nature. A life thus lived is lived according to natural law. This law-keeping is insufficient for salvation, but civil life is about law and outward behavior. It's not about salvation. And that's basically how I understand what the divines said at the Synod of Dort. The fact that people don't use it perfectly or even aright in things natural or civil doesn't mean that it's useless. And that some people have inferred that, and that's not what Dort was saying, and that's not what the Westminster divines were saying, and that's not what the Reformed were saying in the 17th century. Westminster Confession of Faith, chapter 20, paragraph 4 says, and I quote, "For their publishing of such opinions or maintaining of such practices are contrary," watch this, "to the light of nature." Close quote. On Christian liberty, the divines connect the powers ordained by God to maintain order, which was a problem during the English Civil War, with this troublesome expression, at least troublesome for some, the light of nature. This language and way of thinking about civil life was well and deeply ingrained in Reformed orthodoxy in the 16th and 17th centuries. In this article, the confession even contrasts this source of knowledge with the ceremonial laws that expired because they had been fulfilled. Westminster Confession of Faith 21:1 says, "The light of nature showeth that there is a God, who hath lordship and sovereignty over all, is good, and doth good unto all, and is therefore to be feared, loved, praised, called upon, trusted in, and served with all the heart, and with all the soul, and with all the might." The light of nature shows that. The divines make a similar point by contrasting the general function of the law of nature, which teaches us that a due proportion of time should be set apart for the worship of God, and then contrasts that general law with the specific teaching of Scripture regarding the Christian Sabbath. Westminster Confession of Faith 21:7. The contrast here is between common life and stated worship. The former, common life, is lived according to the light of nature. Instead of applying the regulative principle of worship to all of life, and then practically to none of it, the divines distinguished between daily life and stated worship. The rule of worship, or the regulative principle, applies to stated worship. It's derived from special revelation, not general or natural revelation, the light of nature, as they would have said. They always assume that for civil life and order, natural law can be known. They even go so far as to teach that the law of nature teaches that, in general, a due proportion of time be set apart for worship. You can know that from nature. You don't need Scripture to tell you that, according to the divines. You need Scripture to tell you when to worship, but not that you should worship and that you should set aside a due proportion of time. You can know that from nature. Isn't that amazing? Unlike some contemporary Reformed people, the divines believe that there is a natural law, that it can be known, and that it contains specific precepts that are revealed with sufficient clarity to be applied even by the unregenerate to specific instances. The skepticism that too many, have demonstrated towards the relative clarity, the old word is perspicuity, of natural law is not only late modern, right? Who could know anything really? That's the way that late modern people think, postmoderns we say, but it's against the confession.
Thanks for listening. Tune in tomorrow for more from the Heidelcast, brought to you by Heidelberg Reformation Association.org. Don't forget, when the coin in the coffer clinks, the cost of bandwidth shrinks. Copyright Heidelberg Reformation Association. All rights reserved. This is a Heidel Media production.
For this podcast, the Heidelcast.